So hello everyone. This is the first of two videos I'm going to record on Rene Descartes to replace our class on Thursday. Also, both videos together will be a little bit longer than your traditional class, so it'll also cover part of the class that we missed a week or so ago, but just part of it. So in these two videos, I'm going to talk to you about Rene Descartes. Introduce you just in this first shorter video. I'm going to introduce you to Descartes and say some more general things about him. And in the second video, I'm going to go through the rest of the text itself after covering some of the introduction in this lecture. So Descartes, let me go back to his picture here. This is a photograph of one of the, or not a photograph, but a painting, one of the most famous paintings of Descartes. Descartes, as you can see, lived from 1596 to 1650. He's the second author that we're talking about in this section on the scientific revolution. And already you know quite a bit about Descartes because we've been comparing Descartes since the very first lectures on the scientific revolution. We've been comparing him with Descartes as the kind of opposite figure, right? Bacon is known as ought not to be, but is often known as the father of empiricism, or at least the father of empirical experimental philosophy, whereas Descartes is the father of, often called the father of modern philosophy, but he is certainly the kind of first and most extreme case of what is later called rationalism. And in science, rationalism amounts essentially to the idea that science should aspire to be a deductive system much like that of mathematics or geometry, where the first principles, the goal of science is really to arrive at the first principles, to reach certainty about those first principles, and then to use deductive logical arguments to derive everything else as a consequence, right? So the model, we do this, of course, in science. We start with fundamental principles and we prove things based on them. But you're going to see that Descartes is much more radical than any contemporary living kind of physicist or other scientist who may, like Descartes, give a lot give a very large role to deduction, mathematical argumentation, and so on. We'll see in many ways he's the direct opposite of Bacon. And when I told you, when we opened the scientific revolution, I said it was going to be interesting because what we see in this course is that people like Bacon and Descartes actually come after science has already been going for a while, and they're trying to diagnose and explain and justify to a certain extent the methods as they see them of modern mathematical physical sciences. But their diagnoses, their understandings of these are completely different. So, as I said, Descartes lived from 1596 to 1650. He's a Frenchman, as you know. Many of you probably read some of his works for that reason, maybe in high school. He was Catholic by his family was Catholic. He grew up and was educated in a Catholic school called the Flesh. Here's a picture, kind of a painting of the Jesuit college where Descartes was educated. So he learned all the kind of traditional Aristotelian scholastic philosophy while he was young. Then, as he got a little bit older, he wasn't a particularly great student. It doesn't seem his desire wasn't to go really into academics or to become a professor or a priest or any of those things. And as a young man, he tells us himself he became a little bit desirous to see the world at large, right? To explore, and to do so, he joined a number of armies in Europe and did odd jobs in the armies, right, and got paid for this. And along the way, he found that he had some talents, right, in mathematics and in what we would now call engineering. And this led him to make contact with a number of other people who were working at the time in certain areas of early modern science, not associated with astronomy like Copernicus, but rather with methods in science that are closer to what Galileo was doing, considering issues about masses and their motion relative to gravity and the interaction and of bodies, physical bodies when they run into each other and so on. And these kinds of, because these things are relevant to engineering and are obviously the trajectories of missiles and things are very important for war and for the military. So these things became of interest to him, and he met among these people a man named Isaac Beeckman. Beeckman was a Dutchman working in this kind of early modern science. Some of the main ideas of these early engineers, you might call them, was first of all that the central way in which science works is by creating kind of mathematical models, right? That's very much what engineers do, right? They try to create a mathematical model that describes the thing that they are trying to understand or improve. They draw diagrams and so on, and they try to show that given certain geometrical principles governing the pictures that they draw, that a certain amount of force is required to move a lever or whatever. Another core idea of this kind of early modern engineering was the more broad theory of atomism, or at least of what's called corpuscularism. Atomism, I'm sure is the theory that everything is made up of uncuttable, truly indestructible fundamental atoms. Atom in Greek means not cuttable. Atom. That was a view that existed from ancient times and was in part revived even by Bruno. There's another related belief or idea that is called corpuscularism. Corpuscularism, a corpse, of course, is a body, right? So a corpuscle was a word for a small body. And corpuscularism was the theory that everything physical is composed of little bodies. Now, that's slightly different from atomism, because atomism is committed to the idea that there are some smallest bodies that are indestructible. Atomism is a kind of corpuscularism, right? But not all corpuscularism is atomism. So you might believe that everything is made up of little bodies, little particles of matter, but perhaps that those particles of matter are not indestructible, or maybe they can be infinitely cut into smaller and smaller pieces. And then you are a corpuscularist, but you are not an atomist. Now, why was that a very important view that they had? Well, because it was a very useful hypothesis for dealing with problems in things like fluid dynamics and other things. They assumed that fluids, for instance, or even light, they had this hypothesis, Descartes had this hypothesis, that light or fluids or other such things in nature are actually made of small bodies, and that they could try to calculate the behavior of these things by thinking about them as collections of an innumerably large number of tiny bodies operating just as billiard balls work on a table, but just on a much smaller scale, and with many more combined. So that flowing water would kind of be like billions of billiard balls moving through a tube. And if you might, based on that, be able to make some kind of mathematical calculations, which is what they tried to do. So Descartes worked under this man who was older than him, Beeckman, and learned many things about this. And Beeckman gave him exercises, some of which still exist, kind of homework he gave to Descartes. And through this, Descartes became extremely convinced that the key to understanding everything lies in some method that is very similar to, and in fact is continuous with, this kind of mathematical method by which one builds a model, understands the components of the model, and then applies that and uses that to understand physical reality. And of course, the basis of that was geometry. So he understood the basis of knowledge if mathematics is the key to understanding nature, then and geometry is kind of the most prominent form of mathematics applicable to physical nature around us, then the structure of geometry in terms of its deductive structure is also going to be central to the structure of science, right? And Descartes, in fact, believed, as you'll see in the next video, that physical nature is nothing but geometry, solidified geometry, as it were. Now, in thinking all this, Descartes was obviously inspired by and very close in the way he thought to Galileo, right? He said some things about Galileo earlier in the course. Of course, Galileo was inspired by Copernicus, by the mathematical models and the mathematical way of thinking. But Galileo went even further. He famously said that, nature is, the book of nature is written in a special language, and that language is mathematics, and only people who know the words in that language, circles, squares, and so on, can read the book of nature. So he too saw mathematics as the key. The thing is, neither Copernicus nor Galileo nor anyone else before them ever attempted to prove, this takes us back to Copernicus, right? They never tried to prove or had any inkling of how one might prove that the true way to understand nature is through mathematics. They got this conviction from their experiences in science itself. Well, Descartes, we're going to see as a philosopher, actually personally, as we see, he started out as an engineer. But when he got to a certain age, he was actually still in his early 20s, that he became aware of the, let me find one of these, some other things Descartes 4, the Cartesian coordinate system. This is named after him. So I was saying, one second, I've lost my train of thought. Yes. So, when he's in his early 20s, he starts to have some idea that there is a method, a universal method for solving all scientific problems. And this is still a method within natural science, right? This is still a method for physics, for chemistry, for medicine. He thought there's just one method. It's a universal method. And he thought that he had discovered it. And so he thought the next thing he would need to do, this for him was almost a religious experience. He even describes it in a series of dreams, how this came to him, and it was extremely kind of traumatic at the same time and led him to go on a pilgrimage. And so it had a kind of religious fire to the way, he experienced this breakthrough into the universal method. But the next thing he decided to do was that he would try to publish this method. And he realized that if he simply wrote a book that said, here's this method, it can solve anything, it might not be particularly accepted or believed unless he could show that he was able to solve problems that no one had been able to solve before using this new method. So he thought, here's the strategy. What I'll do is I'll solve several very, very key problems in natural science that no one has a solution to. I will publish those as examples of the application of my method, and then I will publish my method along with it. And so he started to compose a book called The World, which would have all of this in it, and would have several very important examples of the application of his method. Well, as he was preparing that, he got word of the condemnation of Galileo, that Galileo had been condemned for defending Copernicus. And Descartes, being he's a very clever guy, Descartes realized that if he stuck with his method was the method of Galileo, was the method that would perhaps lend a good deal of evidence to the work of Copernicus, that this was very dangerous. So he immediately dropped plans to publish his book. And he withdrew from doing science for a short period. And he describes this in one of his books as a moment where he realized he had to retreat back to philosophy. So he had to move from science, which he was mainly just a scientist, back to metaphysics. Because the methods, remember the whole idea that that was used against Copernicus, which was that according to Aristotle, the mathematical method was not the proper method of natural science. That Descartes now realized that if he was going to do anything but get condemned, he would have to find a defense, a philosophical defense, that would help him to show that Aristotle was wrong about the nature of the mathematical method. In fact, Descartes' goal was to go back to metaphysics, to philosophy, to try to find a kind of proof that nature was mathematical in its essence, and therefore the kind of mathematics and the kind of physics and kind of science he was trying to do was the only one that could deliver truth. So this is what he did, and he retreated. He wrote a few books. He was very concerned with about whether he would get into trouble for this, because he was a very good Catholic, right? And so he published his first book, the Discourse on the Method, right? And so this is on his method, and there he published this anonymously, so that he wouldn't obviously get into trouble, and he could kind of gauge what people would say about it. Well, he published the Discourse on the Method, and it was fairly well received. And then he decided to publish the Meditations on First Philosophy. Some of you have probably read some of this, the 6 Meditations on First Philosophy. And this is kind of where he lays out in the most detail this philosophical attempt to lay out his physics. Now, this is an odd text in a lot of ways, because he doesn't talk about physics. He doesn't. Everything that I've said about his career and that the goal had anything to do with Copernicus, of course, you won't find any of that in the Meditations itself. When you open up the Meditations, and maybe there's a picture of the book of the Meditations. Here you go, Meditations on First Philosophy. When you open up the Meditations, what you instead find is Descartes explaining what's called his method of doubt. We'll talk about that in the next video. But essentially, he talks about the self, the I. He proves that he himself exists early in the book. Then he moves on to prove that God exists and that his own soul is immortal. Right? He gives 3 different proofs of God's existence. So if you open that book, the book seems like, and Descartes presents it as, a kind of philosophical attempt to prove the truths of the Catholic and Christian faith, right? That in the beginning he was in doubt about whether he could have any certainty about anything in the world. He slowly discovered that I think, therefore I am, that he himself must exist. And within his own mind, he discovers that he cannot but believe, and in fact has an objective proof that there is a creator who has created him and who has created the world, and that his soul is naturally immortal, and so on. And so he presents this as a philosophy that, interestingly, is better than the Aristotelian philosophy, because remember, the Aristotelian philosophy was not originally a Christian philosophy. It was adopted by the Christian church. And Aristotle's philosophy, much of it actually conflicted with the Christian doctrines. Right? Aristotle didn't have any idea of an immortal soul in the sense of Christians had. He also didn't have the concept of the Aristotelian God was not a creator God. Aristotle also didn't even allow for creation. He believed the world and argued that he had proofs that the world was eternal. So there were many things about Aristotle that should have dissatisfied the Catholic Church, but those are the best that they had, right? So Descartes, by offering this new philosophy, in a certain sense can say, look, this is first philosophy. That's another word for metaphysics. My metaphysics is better than Aristotle's because it leads us immediately to the fundamental truths at the heart of the Christian religion. The immortality of the soul and the existence of God, that God is an all-powerful, creative being that is good and wise and so on. Now, interestingly, at the end of that book, Descartes uses that to draw some conclusions about God's creation. Namely, that given everything that he says earlier in the book, God must have created the world in a way that is clear and can be clearly and distinctly conceived by human beings. And that the only way that human beings clearly and distinctly conceive anything is by virtue of mathematics. And therefore God must have created the world as it were, as if he were himself a geometer. Right? He created the world as one who would see nature through its mathematical structure. And so at the very end of the Meditations, you find a kind of final justification for mathematical physics, for a non-Aristotelian physics. Now, Descartes, again, doesn't draw attention to this. Why? Because, of course, Aristotle is still the church physicist. There were people at the time who got in serious trouble with the Catholic Church and were forced not to teach and so on in Paris, because they tried to revise Aristotle, let alone try to replace him. So we know this was Descartes' strategy overall, because he wrote a letter to a good friend of his who happened to be a Catholic priest. And he's told his friend Arnaud that he says, the entire foundation of my physics is found in the Meditations, but don't tell anyone, because the Aristotelians will get on my case. And he didn't want his... this is one thing you'll learn about Descartes, is that he always wanted his philosophy. He didn't want a confrontation with the church. He wanted... he believed in, modern science, and he knew that the church was against many aspects of it. But he tried to present himself always as the most pious, the most, in line, the most deferent to the church. So he was really trying to find a strategy by which to push forward science in the Copernican direction without running into the problems that Copernicus and Galileo did. So he, nevertheless, at the heart of his philosophy, we always run into this question about whether it is truly consistent with the views of the church. Because at the end of the day, Descartes' philosophy is really about gaining self-certainty about things in nature. And as we saw talking about the Pope and his views of Galileo and in relationship to Copernicus, one of the core views of the popes of the time was that human beings can't reach certainty in anything. Only revelation makes us certain. Right? So not only is Descartes fighting against the Aristotelians in this, but he's also fighting against a kind of view of science and knowledge that simply says human beings should never claim certainty because of vanity. This is just vanity of the human mind. And so, since Descartes is so focused on certainty throughout his book, as you'll see, this obviously creates issues. Although also he always tries to say, he'll say that we can reach such supreme certainty about so many things, and then as soon as he says that, he will immediately take it back and say, but revelation has the final say. So many of you, I think, will be rather dissatisfied with this aspect of Descartes' philosophy. So this is the Meditations. Let's see. Discourse on the Method. I described this was his first book published anonymously in 1737. Beckmann. This is the Principia. This is the book we're reading in this course, the Principles, right? Now, the Principles turned out to be the book that Descartes, it's multiple volumes, and it was intended, so 1644, he died in 1650, so it's only 6 years before he died. It's towards the end of his life, and it's much later than the Meditations and so on. This was published when he truly had, in a certain sense, succeeded, and the Principia was supposed to be a kind of textbook. So ultimately, what his goal was in his life was to, not so much to break with the church, but to revise the philosophy of the church such that when children would go to, La Flèche and the other Catholic schools, they wouldn't be reading Aristotle, they would be reading Descartes himself. And this would be the textbook that they would hopefully, if Descartes succeeded to use. Now, Descartes' philosophy and his physics in particular was very successful, and you don't hear much about him anymore because there was about a less than a 50-year period that Descartes' physics was the physics of Europe in a certain sense. Because at the end of the 1600s, then came along Newton. And Newton accepted much of what Descartes did, but he also pushed it much further by the creation of the calculus and so on. So much of what it was in Descartes' physics is actually in Newton's physics. So many of the ideas of inertia and so on, these are already found in Descartes. They weren't invented by Newton by any means. Newton simply kind of brought what we call mechanics, or the mechanical philosophy of nature, to kind of its highest perfection, particularly mathematically. So that's why Descartes kind of gets overlooked a little bit in the history of science. But he was a working scientist, mathematician with important results and things of that nature. Okay, so that's a little bit of the introduction on Descartes. Now we're going to turn a little bit to the text. Here's another nice picture of Descartes. Renatus Cartesius. And here's the front page of the Principles. Nothing too interesting here. Now there is something interesting here. This is selections from the Principles. Principles, as I said, was a multi-volume work, and the structure of the Principles is that at the very beginning of it, he begins with his first principles, right? That's why it's called the Principles. The very basis, the most basic, universal, certain principles of knowledge. And then the rest of the books go through all of knowledge kind of deductively to prove it. So it starts with, matter and motion, and then the universe and the planets and the human body, and it builds up from the simple to the more complex. Going from basically the very foundations of physics to medicine and further. That was the goal. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this is the Principia was written obviously in Latin, the Principles of Philosophy, but it was translated into French. And this is very important to keep in mind because, as I've said earlier in this course, this is the period during which people for the first time started writing in Europe in the vernacular, in regular languages. And when they wrote in the language of everyday people, they were not writing for scholars. They were not writing for the church. They were writing to the public, the general public, who would be perhaps buying this book out of interest. And so what's interesting is there are great differences between the Latin version of the text and the French version of the text. That's because the Latin version would be written to be read by people within the church, because that was the language of the church, right? So the Aristotelians would read the Latin version. The French version would be for the man in the street. The French version would be the more radical version, the version where Descartes would perhaps be a little more straightforward about what he had to say. Although, as we said, he's always very, very careful. And you'll see that's true, because in this version, some of the divergences between the Latin and the French text are noted. Now, like a lot of the texts we've read, this book by Descartes begins with a letter, but this is a very odd letter because remember the books of Copernicus was dedicated to the Pope and to other religious figures. Other books we've seen were dedicated to kings and others. So they had a preface that was addressed to them. But here, this is very different. The Descartes' book, because it's the French translation of the Latin book, starts with a letter by the author, so a letter by Descartes to the translator, right? To the French translator of the Principles. So he didn't translate it himself, he had someone else translate it. And then he takes the opportunity to insert a letter. So notice this letter is not going to be in the Latin edition. It's only going to be in the French edition. So this is going to be a place where he can explain things more openly and freely than he might have done in the Latin edition. and maybe he has different things he would want to explain. And so it's a very clever device. We've seen a lot of these authors use very clever means to try to say things without saying them straightforwardly. And here's an excellent example of Descartes' kind of strategic way of saying something without just saying to the reader, right? He could have privately sent a letter to the translator. He doesn't. He publishes the letter in the book itself, because it's not really a letter to the translator. It's a letter to the readers addressed to the translator, right? So this is you can see this is not a letter for the translator, obviously. Now, what does he do in it? He explains his approach to philosophy in general and science in particular. So he says, Sir, the version of my principles which you have been at pains to make is so elegant and finished as to lead me to expect that the work will be more generally read in French than in Latin. He's just saying there, and better understood. So right there, he's telling the readers what? What do you think he's telling the readers? He's telling them that they should read the French version and not the Latin version. He's telling them that without telling them that, right? The only apprehension I entertain is lest the title should deter some who have not been brought up to letters, so who have been educated in the academic style, or with whom philosophy is in bad repute, because the kind they were taught what has proved unsatisfactory, namely Aristotle. And this makes me think that it will be useful to add a preface to it for the purpose of showing what the matter of the work is, the content, the end of the work I had in writing it, what's the purpose, and what's the utility, what would be the use of it. Now, this sounds a lot like Bacon. We saw Bacon do this twice in his text, right? To distinguish and structure his discussion, especially kind of the content and the usefulness and the end as different points of view from which to look at his project. Interestingly, though, we saw with Bacon that the end is the utility. The end is the fruits, right? And the matter was the experiments and so on. But here, the end is distinguished from the utility. So the matter of the work, the end that he had in view in writing it, and what the utility may be derived from it. But although it might be my part to write a preface of this nature, seeing I ought to know those particulars better than any other person, I cannot nevertheless prevail upon myself to do anything more than merely give a summary of the chief points that fall, as I think, to be discussed in it. And I leave it to your discretion. This is another odd strategy of Descartes. He says, I'd like to explain all these things, but I don't really, I can't get myself to do so. But then he does, of course. And then when he does explain what these things are, he says, I would have liked to explain this, and then he explains it, as if he's not explaining it, but he is. It's just one of these weird things of style. So he says, I should have desired, I would have liked in the first place, to explain in it what philosophy is. Oh, so I guess he's not going to explain what philosophy is. Oh, but he will right here. By commencing with the most common matters, as for example, that the word philosophy signifies the study of wisdom. As I'm sure you all know, philo means love, Sophie means wisdom, the love of wisdom. So yes, that's what it means. And that by wisdom is to be understood not merely prudence in the management of affairs, but a perfect knowledge of all that man can know, as well as for the conduct of his life, as for the preservation of his health and the discovery of all the arts, and that knowledge to subserve these ends must necessarily be deduced from first causes. What does he mean by first causes? First principles. From the most fundamental principles in a deductive system, right? So now at first he sounds a bit like Bacon, right? Perfect man. There's subtle differences here, though, because he's saying wisdom. Wisdom is not just knowing how to manage things. It's not just the fruits. It's not just being able to do things. It's having a perfect knowledge that we can of all things that can be known. Not just that, though. It is having such a knowledge necessarily deduced from first causes. So based on a fundamentally, as we'll see, certain set of first principles. Now Now, to do this, we must convince with the investigation of those first causes, first principles. Of course, Bacon, as we saw, Bacon also is interested in principles, but for him, we proceed towards principles. They're the last things that we come to in our science. For Descartes, because he has a deductive method, the first thing you must arrive at are the principles, right? So we must commence with the investigation of those first causes, which are called principles. Now, these principles must possess two conditions. And we'll see, although for Bacon, principles are the most difficult thing you arrive at, right? It's the last thing we may never arrive at in science. For Descartes, they are the simplest and the first things we arrive at. And there are only two criteria, he says here, right? Two conditions that must be satisfied for our first principles to be achieved and ready for use, right? So it sounds like it's a very, very simple matter. It says, in the first place, these conditions, the principles, must be so clear and evident that the human mind, when it attentively considers them, cannot doubt of their truth. So in other words, to be a first principle, they must be, he uses these terms, clear and evident. Elsewhere he says clear and distinct to the mind, that when it thinks about them, it cannot doubt their truth. Now, keep that in mind for later when he's the I think, therefore I am. He says, cannot be doubted that I exist. That's, therefore, I think, therefore I am is a first principle of his philosophy, right? That's one of the criteria of being a first principle, is its indubitability. In the second place, the knowledge of other things must be so dependent on them as that, though the principles themselves may indeed be known apart from what depends on them, the latter cannot nevertheless be known apart from the former. So you can read this for yourself. It's a little bit of a complicated sentence, but all he's actually saying there is, well, first, the first principles must be indubitable. And second, all other knowledge must be that is not a first principle must be derived from the first principles. That's it, right? It will accordingly be necessary thereafter to endeavor so to deduce from those principles the knowledge of the things that depend on them. And as there may be nothing in the whole series of deductions which is not perfectly manifest. God is in truth the only being who is absolutely wise. So now he's continuing. As I said, whenever he says something about how human beings will achieve, or his goal is to achieve, notice we said, where's the certainty? Must be so evident and clear the human mind, when it attentively considers them, cannot doubt their truth, right? It must be certain of them. But then immediately after he says that, he says, God in truth is the only being who is absolutely wise. That is, who possesses a perfect knowledge of all things. But we may say that men are more or less wise as their knowledge of the most important truths is greater or less. So that's the first thing, right? That was what we call the matter of the work, I suppose. Then he doesn't go to the end next, or was this the end? Let me see. Yeah, he doesn't really say here, but we'll clarify that as we go on. The next thing he talks about is the utility of philosophy, right? He says so that at least we know how that maps up to here. The utility is right here. I should, in the next place, have proposed to consider the utility of philosophy, and at the same time have shown that, since it embraces all that the human mind can know, we ought to believe that it is by it we are distinguished from savages and barbarians, and that the civilization and culture of a nation is regulated by the degree in which true philosophy nourishes it, and accordingly, that to contain true philosophers is the highest privilege a state can enjoy. Now this sounds a lot like some things we read and talked about in Copernicus. Because for Copernicus, he had this idea that the possession of astronomy ennobles a society. And here Descartes is arguing it's the possession of philosophy, right? The possession of philosophy, but philosophy in the form he's describing as certain knowledge from first principles. He says it's philosophy that distinguishes savages us from savages and barbarians. We are not barbarians or savages because we have philosophy, right? And that the civilization and culture of a nation is regulated so that the degree of civilization and culture in your nation is dependent upon the degree in which there is philosophy, true philosophy in it. And the privilege, it's the privilege of the society to have true philosophers. So it's very much like this model that we saw in Copernicus, of this idea of the higher things as making us better, ennobling. And so knowledge of higher things can ennoble us. And so that society itself should value those things. Besides this, I should have shown, as regards individuals, that it's not only useful for each man to have intercourse with those who apply themselves to the study, but that it is incomparably better he should himself direct his attention to it, just as it is doubtless to be preferred that a man should make use of his own eyes to direct his steps and enjoy by means of the same beauties of color and light, than that he should blindly follow the guidance of another. This is one of the classic images of modern philosophy, which is that by the use of reason and science, we open our eyes and we think for ourselves and we guide ourselves with our own eyes instead of walking blindly and being led by another. And Descartes says here, it's not only is it ennobling of the society to have philosophy, but it's incomparably better for an individual themselves to direct their attention to philosophy and science. Because in that way, they are no longer blindly following others. So it's about autonomy and about self-determination, right? And this is one of the key values of the modern period. Finding, expression here in Descartes. So to live without philosophizing is, in the truth, the same as keeping the eyes closed without attempting to open them. And the pleasure of seeing all that sight discloses is not to be compared to the satisfaction afforded by the discoveries of philosophy. So not only is it more noble, it's also more pleasurable. It's more pleasurable to know things oneself than to know them only secondhand, right? Now, in the next part of the text here, he talks about, so if everybody is supposed to be able to do philosophy, right, then at the same time, everybody must be capable of doing philosophy, right? If we're not to follow others, but follow our own insight, our own minds, then we must be capable of doing that. And so he argues that that's not everyone's view, right? Many people think there are people of lesser intelligence and so on that couldn't do this. So how is this consistent with what Descartes is saying? He says here, there is no mind, how ignoble soever it be, which remains so firmly bound to the objects of the senses, as not sometime or other to turn itself away from them in the aspiration after some higher good, although not knowing frequently wherein the good consists. So there's no one who could not possibly turn towards philosophy and away from the senses. I mean, there's no one that is so kind of tied to the senses that they couldn't do that. Now, this tells us something already very obviously, right? That Descartes sees philosophy as a turn away from the senses, right? So the others, it's almost by contrast here. There's no mind, how ignoble, how low and mean it might be, which remains so firmly bound to the objects of the senses that it cannot turn away from them in the aspiration after some higher good, right? So already a few things. He's equating his turn towards philosophy and towards certainty with a turn towards what is good, but also a turn away from the senses, right? Exactly the opposite of Bacon, right? Bacon saw the mind and the senses as corrupted and as misleading, but the mind was surely not where you turn in order to correct those errors. The mind is the source of all the errors, and it needs the senses and experimentation to correct it. Now, he even goes further, said he regards this kind of philosophy, deductive science, as not only good, but here he says, the supreme good, considered by natural reason without the light of faith. So leaving aside what good might be revealed through religion, and thinking only of the goods that we can know in this world, that supreme good is nothing more than knowledge of the truth through its first causes. In other words, the wisdom of which philosophy is the study. So the philosophy is the means and the study of the highest good for human beings, knowable by natural reason, and that is a kind of wisdom. What kind of wisdom? It is a wisdom that consists in knowledge of truth through the first causes, through deductively, through clear and distinct certain principles. Now, in these next couple of passages, what Descartes does is he takes us through the various kinds of knowledge there are. He thinks there are various degrees of knowledge, in fact. And this is a way of introducing us to the highest degree of knowledge, which is this knowledge of truth through first causes, which he proposes to teach us later in the book. So what are these different ways of knowing things? He says, I should have shortly explained wherein consists all the sciences we now possess. So this is like, remember Bacon assessed the previous sciences and what was wrong with them. That's what Descartes is also going to do before he introduces us into his own final way, kind of knowledge, the best knowledge. He's first going to tell us about the lesser forms of knowledge, which of course for him are going to be the kinds of knowledge that people used in the past. So he says, I would have shortly explained wherein consists all the science we now possess and what are the degrees of wisdom at which we have arrived. The first degree of wisdom, meaning the lowest, meanest, least certain degree of wisdom or knowledge, contains only notions so clear of themselves that they can be acquired without meditation. Now, this sounds like clear and distinct ideas, I know, but it's not. Clear and distinct principles are going to be in the very last form, the one he's offering. This is the first and least interesting and least certain. So why does it sound so similar? Because what he means here by the first degree are only notions so clear of themselves that they can be acquired without meditation. His philosophy, we'll see, remember meditations on first philosophy, his philosophy requires deep meditation to arrive at those first principles. But this is a kind of knowledge that attempts to know things without any deep meditation. What he means is just like everyday things that we just experience, that the sun rises every day, that hot water will burn your hand. These things are fairly certain, right? But we don't have any kind of a scientific knowledge of them. We just accept them without thinking about it. That's what he's referring to. That's the lowest kind of knowledge a person can have. It's just this kind of everyday, if you drop a cup, it breaks, whatever, right? You drink too much alcohol, you don't live very long, and so on. So that's the first kind. The second comprehends all that the experience of the senses dictates. So this is empirical experience. This is where Bacon's knowledge would fit, right? Experience that the senses dictates. The third, that which the conversation of other men teaches us. So what we learn from conversation with other people, to which may be added the fourth, the reading not of all books, but especially of such as have been written by persons capable of conveying proper instruction, for it is a species of conversation we hold with their authors. So also reading books of other people. In a way, there's a kind of structure here, right? Because this is like, this first is just knowledge we get from without thinking about it from our environment. And the second is a kind of more regimented experimental knowledge we get from nature. And those two are kind of parallel with the third and the fourth. The first parallels the third. The third is just conversation that we have with people around us, right? Just like this is just experience we find around us. And the second and the fourth are parallel, and that the second is like regimented scientific experiments, right? Or what Bacon would call experiments, experiences. And the second is not just talking to anybody or reading whatever. It's kind of a more intentional, rigorous reading of books, of good books, by people who deserve to be read, right? And it seems to me that all the wisdom we ordinarily possess is acquired in only these four ways. For I do not class divine revelation among them, since it does not instruct by degrees, but elevates us at once to an infallible faith, right? As I said, whenever he talks about human certainty or knowledge, he always makes sure that he ends with a kind of, gesture towards revelation or religion as kind of being outside of the bounds and better and more certain than what he's talking about. Now he says, now those are the four that we've always had, but he says, in all ages, great minds have endeavored to look for a fifth road to wisdom, incomparably more sure and elevated than the other four. So philosophers have, since ancient times, Plato, Aristotle, he talks about here in quite a bit of detail, Epicurus and others, they have always looked for a fifth and thought that there might be a fifth way that was even more certain and better than any of those four, right? He spends a long time criticizing the followers of Aristotle and so forth. Let's see, where is he going to... here we go. So here, after the kind of digression where he discusses Plato and Aristotle and how, although they wanted and thought that there might be such a fifth road, they never discovered it. And their followers never discovered it either, but just remained addicted to, their works and their sayings and interpreting Plato and Aristotle. Now, at this point in the text, he returns back to the fifth way, right? So now he's going to tell us about it. He says, after making those matters clear, I should, in the next place, have desired to set forth the grounds for holding that the true principles by which we may reach the highest degree of wisdom, wherein consists the sovereign good of human life, are those I have proposed in this work. And two considerations alone are sufficient to establish this. Again, remember we talked about two conditions of such knowledge? Same two things are going to happen here. The first of which is that these principles are very clear, right? First is that they are very clear. And second, that we can deduce all other truths from them. It's the same two things he said earlier, right? He will show further in the work that these are the only two conditions that have to be fulfilled. And if we truly rigorously apply this method, all our knowledge will be certain, right? And science will be, this doesn't sound like a very radical method. It is radical in some ways, but we'll have to understand that fully, we'll have to look a little bit later. Right now, what I can say is, it doesn't sound like much because he's saying, well, the principles have to be very clear, but he hasn't told us what clear is yet, right? Clear and distinct. And it'll turn out that the only way of understanding something that is truly clear and distinct is a certain types of concepts we're going to find in the first part, and most especially in the second or later parts, mathematical ideas are clear and distinct, right? The second, that we can deduce all other truths from them, so that deductive structure of science. For it is only these two conditions, that are required in true principles. But I easily prove that they are very clear, firstly, by reference to the manner in which I found them, the principles, namely by rejecting all propositions that were in the least doubtful. So he's anticipating his method here. He's going to discover his true propositions by rejecting anything in the least doubtful, and what he cannot reject as doubtful must be certain. For it is certain that such as could not be rejected by this test when they are attentively considered are the most evident and clear by which the human mind can know. Thus, by considering that he who strives to doubt all is unable nevertheless to doubt that he exists while he doubts, and that reasons thus in not being able to doubt of itself and doubting nevertheless everything else, is not that which we call our body, but what we name our thought. Namely, so what is doing the doubting that he exists? It's not his body that doubts that he exists. He can actually doubt that his body exists, and there's no problem with that. But he cannot doubt that he, as a thinking being who is doubting, exists. That's the thing that cannot be rejected and is therefore certain. So from all of that, I've taken the existence of this thought, the thought of myself, for the first principle, from which I very clearly deduced the following truths, namely, that there is a God who is the author of all that is in the world, and who, being the source of all truth, cannot have created our understanding of such a nature as to be deceived in the judgments it forms of things, of which it possesses a very clear and distinct perception. So he's adumbrating the path of his thought in this book, right? Same thing he did in the Meditations. He rejects everything that can be doubted. He discovers one principle or one thought that cannot be doubted, which is namely his own existence. From this thought of his own existence, which he takes as his first principle, he proves that there's a God that created the world, and that that God is the source of all truth and is good, and so could not have created me such that I would be in error of regarding at least the things that are very clear and distinct. And by perception, he means not sensible perception, not feeling or perception of the senses, but perception in the mind. The things I clearly and distinctly perceive in my mind cannot be false, because God created me, and God is the creator and source of all truth. Now, as I said, what's the question is then, what are the things that are very clear and distinct? Because not everything is. Well, Aristotelian science for Descartes will not be clear and distinct, and the concepts it is based on will not be clear and distinct. So they will not be certain, and they will be rejected. What will be clear and distinct are all the principles required for mathematical modern science and geometry applied to nature. And therefore, voila, you've got it. The entire strategy, prove that there's an indubitable principle from which God's existence is derived deductively. The fact that God created me to know the truth when things are clear and distinct, proven deductively. And then the linchpin, that the only things that are truly clear and distinct are things of the kind that we describe in primary qualities, namely measure, shape, motion, the things that are mathematically expressible. Those are all the principles of which I avail myself touching immaterial or metaphysical objects, and from which I clearly deduce these other principles of physical or corporeal things, namely that there are bodies extended in length. What are these? Not that they have flavors or colors or all the secondary qualities, but the primary qualities, length, breadth, and depth, which are of diverse figures and are moving in a variety of ways, the mathematical features. Such are in total, the principles from which I deduce all other truths. The second circumstance that proves the clearness of these principles is that they have all been known all in ages, etc. Let's see. More stuff about how just, this method, it could be practiced in principle by everyone and is available to everyone. There's this little issue here. This is about morals. So Descartes' method is very radical, right? It in certain says we need to rebuild all of knowledge from the foundations up. And he's worried, of course, that could sound too radical to some people, because it says, in a certain sense, suspend everything everyone has ever told you. Suspend all knowledge from the past. Rely only on what's in your own mind, your own judgment of clarity and distinctness. That is, and reconstruct and accept only those things that pass the test that I've offered for certainty of knowledge. That would seem to open us up to the possibility, at least, that what is true about the world is radically different from what the church thinks or anyone else thinks from the past or so on, right? That would seem extremely disruptive. But Descartes here in this passage, on page 140, tries to take care of that objection by saying, in a certain sense, all of this is a theoretical enterprise, searching for certainty. We reject things of which we are not certain, not because we truly reject them in our everyday lives, but because we methodologically, we temporarily reject them for the purpose of finding certainty. And so we don't abandon all our beliefs. We only abandon them kind of on the philosophical level. We don't actually abandon them in life. And by this he means we form for ourselves, he says, before we do any of this deep radical meditation, which could lead to a fundamentally different way of thinking about the world and of what's good and so on, we form for ourselves what he calls a code of morals. A kind of set of rules to live by, which is consistent with what the public and society and the church wants us to do. And we live by that, right? And we live by that until we have reason to improve it. But in the meantime, while we're doing our metaphysics and we're revising knowledge, we stick to what's acceptable in our society. Now, in these passages, Descartes talks about, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about here in this video, or just about the last thing, I think. Yeah. Descartes here has this very nice image. I think it comes from Bacon, actually. There's this image of knowledge as a tree, right? And how that tree is structured. Now, if you're a Baconian, right, you believe kind of that knowledge is like this. There's kind of well, let's read the little passage here by Descartes. That's easiest, I think. Thus, all philosophy is like a tree. Philosophy means all knowledge, right? Philosophy is a very general term in this period, just encompassing all knowledge, all kinds, physics, everything. All philosophy is like a tree, of which metaphysics is the root. It's the root of the tree, right? So you got your tree, and then metaphysics, that's a phi, is the roots. Physics, let's just make that as phi, is the trunk. The other branches that grow out of the trunk are medicine, right? Medicine, mechanics, and ethics. Right? So for Descartes, this is, I said Bacon had this notion of a tree as well, but the tree, notice metaphysics is the roots, physics is the trunk. So physics, everything goes through physics for Descartes. Everything, the most fundamental of the sciences after metaphysics is physics, because we see everything. This is kind of, I'm thinking of, this is not like Bacon, is very much like Galileo and others, trying to reconstruct, the way that everything else operates by its basic physical mathematical models. That's very much physics, right? But then we have medicine, mechanics, and ethics. And these are the fruits that come out, right? Fruits grow on the branches. So metaphysics is the foundation. And for Descartes, the first principles are found in metaphysics, right? That's the metaphysics. So his whole philosophy is oriented towards the first thing. If you want a good tree with good fruits, you don't try to get the fruits. You don't even think about the fruits. You start with examining the first principles, the roots, and make sure the roots are healthy and strong. And then you trace slowly through the trunk and watch it grow. And then you watch the branches grow and follow them in detail until finally the last thing you reach are the fruits. Remember, this is the exact opposite of Bacon. Bacon is kind of the other way. So Descartes would say, how do you find, if you asked Descartes, how do you find good fruit to eat? He says, well, first, you need to start with, the genetic engineering stage. And you start from the very foundation, and you watch the roots grow, and then the tree grow, and then you get the fruits. And Bacon says no. It's the exact opposite. We just look for trees. We look for trees, and when we find a tree, we taste the fruits. And if the fruits are good, then the tree is good, right? So the judgment of the criteria of science and whether science is working and functioning is whether, for Bacon, is always the fruits. It's the quality of the fruits. Whereas for Descartes, the criterion of knowledge is in the roots and in the kind of inner fiber and foundation of the tree. And then the fruits are the last thing that you arrive at. So Descartes, the fruits are at the end. Bacon, so the principles are at the beginning for Descartes, and the fruits at the end. And for Bacon, the fruits are at the beginning and are all throughout, and the principles are at the end and maybe even never. So this is kind of another way in which they are. He talks about this down here in the fruits and so on. So that is the end of this video. I'm going to wrap this up. There is a second video for you to watch, and there will eventually be a quiz up. So I hope you enjoyed that.